Hey guys, welcome back. I want to talk about traumas because let's be honest, we all go through trauma during the course of our life. Let's just sit for 1 second and think about the amount of trauma that you can go through. You can go through physical trauma, emotional trauma, sexual trauma. You could have experienced a natural disaster. You could have gotten into an accident. You could have been the victim of domestic violence. You could have had childhood trauma, which is basically neglect or abuse on a physical level or emotional level. You could have experienced a medical trauma. Maybe you got diagnosed with a really terrible disease and you had to kind of overcome that. Maybe you went to war and now you have war-related trauma. Maybe you experienced loss or grief. Like, let's just look at that list right there. And every one of us that even heard all of those things can go down that list and say, I've experienced this, I've experienced this. The problem with trauma is that most people don't know how to deal with trauma. Now, if we think about the course of our life, there's plenty of traumas that we go through early on where we have absolutely no awareness of what's actually happening. When we're a child, we're just experiencing everything emotionally. We're not able to logically understand what's happening. Even as an adult, we have that logical part of our brain, but when we go into situations like a near-death experience, like maybe we're dealing with domestic violence or we're in a narcissistic relationship, when we're in those environments, it's almost like we're a child again. We don't understand how to really process what's happening to us. This, of course, is why post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD even exists. The PTSD that comes up, whether it's a flashback, a memory, whatever it is not meant to scare you. It's actually meant to bring that situation to the surface so you can process how emotionally you were feeling and also to help you to rationally see the situation in a different way. Because a lot of the times when we experience trauma, we're not able to process anything because our body goes straight into fight or flight. Unfortunately, these experiences that we go through in life that are really uncomfortable sometimes really will alter our nervous system and keep us in fight or flight, which is not a healthy place to be. The fight or flight that you're experiencing or the PTSD that you're experiencing, and actually being in fight or flight is a symptom of PTSD, but all of those things are things that should be dealt with. And we don't have any information, any knowledge, any understanding of really how to deal with these situations, not as they're happening. Because like I said, some situations are too drastic that we're not going to be able to like emotionally deal with how we feel and rationally understand the situation. We're just going to try to go into fight or flight and save ourselves from being uncomfortable or causing us any amount of pain. When people experience trauma, they often also, because they're the victim in this situation, tend to blame themselves. Why was I here? Why didn't I do this? Why did this happen? It must be me. And even though we can sometimes logically understand a situation, emotionally, we can't really always process how we feel. And so every single time you go through a trauma, there's going to be some amount of blame that you're going to put on yourself. This, of course, affects your self-worth. It also affects your ability to rationally think. So if you're just stuck in the emotion of a situation, why did this happen to me? I must have done something wrong. And these are just the stories that you're circling around again and again, then you're not going to be able to rationally see the situation so you can take more control over your emotional state. Resolving trauma is about understanding coping mechanisms, planning how you're going to respond in future challenges that you might have that are similar to the ones that you went through before, establishing a good support system, of course, but it also involves addressing and understanding how you felt in that situation. This will really help and empower people to start actually moving forward. And of course, this is not something that we're just going to do one time. We can't just go to therapy once or sit with the coach one time and kind of have a good cry and let it all out. We have to actually take action steps to help us with our flashbacks, our PTSD. When we're talking about unhealed traumas, and this is the stuff that when you go through something and you don't even realize that you went through something that was that dramatic and that hurtful and that painful, and just how it's actually affecting your life today, these are kind of like the symptoms of unhealed trauma. We're talking about depression, we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about rage, addiction, guilt, flashbacks, insomnia is one, sleeping too much could be another, definitely feeling shame, definitely shutting down, being a people pleaser, walking away when things get hard. Disassociation is probably a really big one. Hyper-independence, and I think that most people don't realize that that actually is a sign of unhealed trauma. Emotional numbness, which is definitely very obvious, just an ability to emotionally connect with people. And of course, things like using manipulation to get what you want. There's two main responses to trauma. We already talked about one, which is fight or flight. Are we going to fight, or are we just going to get out of this situation completely and avoid it? But the other one that most people don't really know is appease and freeze. The appease can actually look like agreeing, being helpful, stepping up as the leader. This response, it kind of ties into that hyper independence. Taking control and helping other people doesn't mean this is going to be my way or the highway. It could just be actually being a people pleaser. The freeze is kind of like the flight. It's just basically not doing anything at all. When we're talking about unhealed traumas and we're looking at things like depression, anxiety, panic attacks, stuff like that, there are so many factors for those things as well. It's not just, oh my God, I have unhealed trauma and that's why I'm depressed. No, it could be the foods that you're eating. It's been proven now that even within our DNA, if your parents were anxious, chances are you're probably going to be anxious too. If your parents had addiction issues, guess what? You're probably prone to addiction issues as well. It doesn't mean that's the route that you have to go down, but it does mean that you're more susceptible to them. When you go through traumatic experiences, the depression, the anxiety, and all of those things that you feel, that experience that you went through, it altered your brain chemistry. If you can't regulate your mood, and one day you're feeling happy, and one day you're feeling sad, and then I'm depressed, and then I'm anxious, that is really because of what you had gone through, or it could also be a sign of just, again, like I said, something within your own DNA. When you go through something and you feel powerless, like you had no control over the situation, most likely you're going to experience rage. You're going to experience some form of anger. All of these kind of symptoms that we're talking about, they're normal responses to what you've gone through. But the problem is that most people don't realize that, oh, my anxiety is linked to this, or oh, my depression is linked to this because of something that I've gone through. Oh, my rage and anger that I'm constantly feeling is because of this. Everything, it just ends up being suppressed. Addiction is a little bit of an easy one because we understand that someone who's addicted to anything, money, work, sex, food, drugs, alcohol, is just an escape to dealing with how they actually feel. Just like when we talked about earlier, when you're in fight or flight, or when you're in appease and freeze, and you're doing that all the time, it is affecting your nervous system, it's affecting your body's responses. And so it's going to be really hard for you to learn how to relax when you're constantly getting these like adrenaline rushes from being in fight or flight. Most people who have a tendency to kind of shut down when things get difficult or a conversation gets really hard, that is a learned defense mechanism. It's also a learned behavior because the person hasn't understood how to process their emotions when they're feeling uncomfortable. So their defense is to just shut down and walk away. This allows them to kind of disassociate from the feelings that they're having that are uncomfortable. It also could help them to really block that vulnerability and getting close to someone by being honest with them on how they actually feel. When we look at things like codependency, obviously, especially for me on this channel, I've talked about that so much because I think it's, well, first off, it's something that I struggled with myself, but it's important to understand just what happens to you in life that causes you to behave the way you behave. And like I've said throughout this whole video, most people are unaware as to the fact that they have addiction, to the fact that they are, walking away or disassociating or playing the victim or doing all of these things because this is just a way for them to, I guess, deal with the uncomfortable feelings that they feel inside, which a lot of it has to do with just your own self-esteem. When you experience trauma, sometimes people will, and this probably rings true more for like narcissistic people, but not all, is playing the victim. This really allows you to get support, get empathy from others, which provides like a real sense of comfort and validation. And these are temporary highs that you are getting because you're getting something from the outside. Hyper independence is something that it gives them a sense of like a protective mechanism that they can use to block themselves from experiencing any future pain. Remember what I said, this is a defense mechanism. This is something that someone's doing to avoid something. And the avoiding something is basically being able to rely on other people. When you've experienced enough trauma and abandonment in your life, this really becomes a defense mechanism for you. It's there because you've been disappointed so many times that you're doing this now just to protect yourself from getting hurt again. The point of me making this video was for you to really understand what are the things that you're still carrying around with you, and how do those wounds, those traumas that you've experienced, things that are uncomfortable, and by the way, you're going to experience them throughout the course of your life because life is really uncomfortable. But when you do experience those things, what's the aftermath? What was the aftermath of you going through that divorce, of going through that childhood experience, of being in that car accident, of, going through that natural disaster? What was the aftermath that you still carry with you that you haven't dealt with? And how is it affecting your life in a negative way? Which, if it's undealt with and unhealed, it's affecting your life in a negative way. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it really educated you. I hope you were able to self-reflect, take down some notes, and kind of really start working on healing from some of those traumas. Don't forget to follow me down below on social media. Everything is linked, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.